I 2 years ago I accepted a 5-week offer to go back to government, and I'm still there. So it's yeah, it's pretty full on. I don't get time to do much else actually. So it's the state government. So I work for the state minister for agriculture and regional development, and Western New South Wales. So anything west of the Blue Mountains, it's that's us. Yeah, 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 oh, yeah. That'll be right. I'll be back there again soon. We had a major storm there, and it just wiped out all of the power and communications. So it was a big deal. Um, you know, yeah, like it was a big deal. So um, we had to coordinate that, but the towers just sort of just fell down, and that's where all the mines are. So it was yeah, big deal. But fortunately, they fixed it, and it's back now. So yeah, all right, yeah, 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 yeah. So we do a lot of work with them. We've just sort of put a lot of money into fixing up the airstrips that they use to fly around. Um, yeah. So the regional development stuff is it takes up a fair chunk of the time, as well as all of the primary industry stuff, because there's some well, you'd be familiar. There's lots of regional communities out there that are doing it tough. Okay. All right. Good to see you again. Yeah. Okay. Okay.
Good afternoon. Welcome to Lunch with Books. Let me just announce the upcoming programs. But first, people have been asking about a new People's University. I'm hearing a little echo because that's coming through Brad's computer, but that's okay. We are going to have one from April through May on the Vietnam War, and I'll be putting out a brochure for that pretty soon. The next program, and that's because it's the 50th anniversary of the fall of Saigon coming up on April. January 21, next week, we'll have our Robbie Burns celebration in this room with food and Scottish music and dance and poetry and the haggis. And I am going to wear a kilt if it comes in time. I have 1 week. Still waiting. But, all right, you got to get here for that. Free food. Delicious haggis. And then on the 28th, the Mine Wars program was canceled and is replaced with Goshen Road. It's a novel by Bonnie Proudfoot, who's originally from New York and Wetzel County and now lives in Athens, Ohio. So she'll be here. And it's about a West Virginia working class family over 2 decades in rural West Virginia. And then on February 4th, former U.S. Attorney Bill Calabash, who had a lot to do with prosecuting organized crime locally, as you mostly know. His book is called Justice Never Rests, and he'll be on here on the 4th. Today we have with us, as you can see on the big screen, our friend Brad Fitzmaurice, all the way from Australia, where it is 4 a.m., 4:01, 4:02 a.m. Tomorrow, tomorrow, everything's upside down, but he's here with us, and he looks pretty good for a man who's up so early. And he got his PhD recently from the University of Sydney. His dissertation examined the growth of wheeling from early settlement to 1900. During his candidacy, he taught classes at Sydney University in U.S. history, mostly on the U.S. Civil War. 2 years ago, he was lured back to full-time employment with the New South Wales state government for a 5-week assignment as Chief of Staff to the New South Wales State Minister for Agriculture, Regional Development, and Western New South Wales. He is still on the job but hasn't stopped thinking about the friendly city. So he's here today to tell us all about his adventures with wheeling. Here he is, Brad Fitzmaurice.
Thanks very much, Sean. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you today from the land of the Darjinkan people, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Also, I'd like to say special thanks to Sean for the opportunity to join you again in this fabulous program that is Lunch with Books. Although, as Sean has said, it feels less like lunch with books and more like early morning breakfast with strong black coffee. I wish I could be with you, notwithstanding the fact that as soon as I finish here, when the sun comes up, I'll walk to the beach and go for a swim. It's about this time also that my natural alarm kicks in, and you may at some point hear some kookaburras in the background. So I apologise if there's any background noise to begin with. Look, I just want to sort of also acknowledge that there are obviously many people in the room that know more than I will ever know about wheeling. So what I thought, rather than sort of try and give you a lecture on wheeling, I'll do three things today. Firstly, explain how someone from Sydney, Australia, came to write a PhD on wheeling, West Virginia. Secondly, I want to just provide an overview of what my research findings were, focusing on where my interpretation differs from more conventional interpretations. And then thirdly, I just want to sort of like touch on and suggest some areas that I think call out for more research. Happy to take questions after the presentation, including in particular, if anyone is interested, why I began by acknowledging the traditional owners today. Okay, so why wheeling? In 2016, I was living in New York, and like a lot of other people, became, I guess, fascinated with the attraction of Donald Trump. And one way I tried to sort of understand that was began to write a short story. And the central character of the story was someone who I thought was a typical Trump supporter. Having sort of created the character, I needed somewhere for him and his family to live. Now, I was in the habit of listening to music when I write. And at one point, I was listening to a song by Neil Sedaka, which ironically was recorded here in Sydney. And it was a song called Wheeling, West Virginia. And it contained the line, "There's no such place as Wheeling, West Virginia. It faded long ago." And I thought, well, that's interesting because it sort of picked up this sense of loss that I was sort of exploring. Now you have to sort of appreciate at the time, I didn't know that there was such a place as Wheeling, West Virginia. I wasn't sure whether or not it was just some sort of fancy construct from some song and dance man from Long Island. Anyway, I started to look around and confirmed, yes, there was in fact a place called Wheeling, West Virginia. And then in the course of sort of digging around, I came across a series of lectures from Dr. Javisek through this very program. I was impressed by a number of things. Firstly, his wardrobe. Secondly, the depth of his knowledge of Wheeling, and as I sort of delved into it and watched it over and over again, I thought, yeah, there is something here that I find very attractive. So I made the effort before I left New York to return to Sydney, to actually come into Wheeling. I didn't know much about the place, and I ended up staying on the island in the casino. But I had a good look around, and I sort of liked what I saw. So I returned to Sydney, and I decided that I would enrol in a PhD. So I turned up to the US Studies Centre, which was an institute attached to the University of Sydney, told them what I wanted to do, and the first person I spoke to said that he would be happy to be my supervisor. He was himself an American. But he said that it would be better, rather than do the PhD through the US Studies Centre, to enrol in the history faculty at the university proper, which is what I did. And I began sort of initially sort of telling people that I was writing a biography of a town. And I thought that was a convenient way of explaining what it was that I was doing. It soon became obvious to me that amongst the faculty, that sort of approach was frowned upon. What sort of I was I guess pushed into was to thinking more about a history of place rather than a biography of a town. And I was particularly influenced by the head of the history department at the time. His name was Mark McKenna. And if anyone is interested in Australian history, I'd thoroughly recommend Mark McKenna, and in particular his biography of Manning Clark, probably Australia's most well-known historians. Anyway, what McKenna sort of was pushing was this idea, and I'm going to quote from him, that histories of place are collections of stories from different perspectives in the same locality. The construction of place is about creating stories as practiced by writers, artists, architects, planners, geographers, and many others. They're all trying to replicate this history of place. Now, again, when I sort of consider, as I had calls last week when Jean sent me her sort of overview of the activities undertaken by the Friends of Wheeling last year, again, it just sort of reinforces that I think that the approach of the Wheeling historical community is beyond what is sort of traditionally seen as local history. it speaks to this idea of history of place, that there are lots and lots of different stories and lots of layers to them. And I came to the realization that you know, good historians are good storytellers. And again, it just seemed to me that Wheeling was this place that was just full of all these wonderful stories from different places. So that's sort of the background. What I sort of did in terms of my dissertation, I had an introductory chapter which looked at, I guess, provided a historiographical analysis of how historians have interpreted the city. I agreed with those who identified Schlesinger as the sort of the first person that really took the fear out of the city for Americans, given his sort of enduring faith in the ability of town planners, bureaucrats, to solve the problems of urban life. I tracked the general disillusionment that set in when it became obvious that the Bronx and places like it were burning, and that there were some real problems. I then sort of looked at more recent work, and in particular, the work of Dr. Hal Gorby, and his work, particularly in South Wheeling, which again sort of reinforced to me this idea that if you're going to understand a particular community, you need to look beyond just the perspective of the great and the good. There are all these sort of different perspectives, and that whole sort of understanding is enriched by looking at all the people that make up that community. In the next chapter, I looked at what most histories of Wheeling do, and the effect of the National Road, the building of the bridge, the decision to locate the terminus of the B&O railway in Wheeling. I was particularly interested in how federal government policy was playing catch up, and how the community influenced the development of that policy. I was also especially interested in how the Wheeling business community was able to influence that government policy. And again, I tracked the development of that business community, its growing confidence, the fact that it was in a position to take on Pittsburgh over the bridge, for example. And I became particularly interested in that sort of outlook of the Wheeling business community, and that's something I might come back to in a little bit of the presentation. What I also then did was to track the development of local government, and I was able to sort of draw upon the work that Erin had done, which I found very useful. I went through the ordinances issued by the local government of Wheeling. I was sort of mindful, I think, when I went through that I thought that maybe the Confederacy really was onto something when it was sort of rebelling against the interference of government in community life. Because when you go through the ordinances, my favourite one, I think, was the ordinance that prescribed not just the size of a bicycle bell, but how many times it could be rung when riding through the streets of Wheeling. By the way, the streets of Wheeling and the cleanliness was something that sort of like just pervades all of the early sort of considerations of the government. I was fascinated by the fact that Wheeling had two tiers of government. It seemed to me to be a very over-governed city. I was also intrigued by just how influential the Sweeney family were in civic government. I then looked at the other things that sort of influence the way a community works, and I was particularly interested in two people in particular. One was Bishop Wheeling, the work that he did, not just through the church, but also through schools and education. And the other fellow that I was particularly interested in was Wheeling's first chief health officer, Dr. James Reeves. And it just seemed to me that what was going on with Reeves' appointment, with what the bishop was doing, what was happening in Wheeling sort of like was a precursor to the more sort of general progressive reforms that took place in American cities around 1900. But it just seemed to me that Wheeling was this great story because it was ahead of the game in many ways. I then looked at again the business community in Wheeling, and I focused on three people in particular. Now, I had hoped to do a deeper search, but unfortunately, during the course of my project, COVID struck. So it meant that I didn't have the opportunity of coming to Wheeling and getting into the archives as much as I had originally planned. So I had to work with the resources that I could sort of access. So I looked at three people in particular: Henry Schmalbach, Augustus Pollock, and Archibald Campbell. Now, again, I realised up front there was nothing I was going to tell people like Ryan about Henry Smallback. There was nothing I was going to tell Sean, our host today, about Augustus Pollock. I was fascinated by the fact that so little work seems to have been done on Campbell, who just seems to me to be just such this sort of influential figure. It just beggars belief why the only thing I could really find was a PhD written from a school of journalism on Campbell, and I mean Campbell's story just speaks to something beyond Wheeling, and I just find it amazing that he's been overlooked in the way that he has. What I was particularly interested in was how those three people influenced the development of this outlook of the business community of Wheeling that became evident, particularly in the years immediately following the Civil War. It's something I called collegiate capitalism. Now, I'll just unpack that a little bit in terms of what I find and how my interpretation differs. And let me say, if you look at Augustus Pollock, he is often sort of portrayed as being somehow different. The recognition that he received from the labour movement, for example, he was used as an exception. I don't see him as such. I see him being typical rather than atypical of this particular mindset that affected the business Wheeling community. And that mindset was based on a collaboration between the labour movement, and the business community. Now, I think there's a number of reasons for that explain that. Firstly, there's geography, and I used William Cronin's work on the development of Chicago, nature's metropolis, as a framework for my overall approach. I think that geography had a lot to do with the development of Wheeling, and in particular the business culture. There's a proximity to it. If you look at those three people I chose, Smallbuck was slightly younger than the other two, but the other two, I mean, they virtually lived in each other's pockets. I mean, they were roughly the same age. They lived and worked in a very close area. They had all these interlocking business relationships, not just in the nail companies, but also in speculative ventures as well. And it just seemed to me that there are people sort of that developed this very close and enduring affinity with their local place and being Wheeling. What also bound them, of course, was this combined interest in the iron industry, and in particular nail manufacture. I looked at nails. I drew heavily on the work of Amos Loveday, who is the only person that I can see had done some proper research on the nail industry in Wheeling. Unfortunately, it looks like most of the company records, the early ones, have been lost. It's fantastic that the library was able to secure the LaBelle records, which I did go through quite extensively, but unfortunately, as I said, most of the records seem to have been misplaced. I think the nail industry is I found it fascinating, and I think there's a story in itself. And I think if we look at 3 generations of people who ran the nail industry, there's a story there in itself. The first nailers, and I'm thinking particularly of the Norton brothers, these were, well, they were cowboys. They were entrepreneurs who were out for a quick buck. They did not have any particular affinity with their local community. They were just in it for as much as they can. So if you look at their activities, it's spread around the region. It's not particularly focused on Wheeling. The second generation of people who ran the nail companies, and I'm thinking particularly here of the people who formed together, joined together to form the LaBelle nail company, which has only had one change in name, by the way. They dropped the L, as it was said to be repetitive. But it just seemed to me that these people who formed this company, they understood how nails were made. They understood life on the factory floor because they were part of it. So they developed this understanding, or they had an understanding of labour relations. The generation that came after that, and I'm thinking perhaps sort of indicative of someone like Alexander Glass. Here's someone who has benefited from an education specifically in management, and in particular, new approaches to management, like, for example, accrual accounting. Now, the significance of accrual accounting is that it shifted the focus away from the selling price of a nail to the cost of producing that nail. Now, once you start thinking about how much it costs to make a nail, that has certain repercussions for labour, which at the time was divided within itself. So within a given factory, for example, you not only had different scales of pay, but different bases on which people were paid. So if you look at the introduction of accrual accounting, you combine that with the developments that were happening up the river in Pittsburgh and the development of these huge conglomerates that are deriving they're seeking their capital not from local communities, but from the big cities on the eastern seaboard, Wall Street. You can see that there is this, the writing's on the wall. And I think the Great Nail Strike of the mid 1880s, it really does sort of like spell the death knell for the wheeling as it emerged. I think it's a fascinating story about the development of American frontier capitalism in itself. But what it also did was that it undermined this sense of collaboration in wheeling between Labor and the people who ran and owned the nail companies. With all of these sort of big conglomerates, like the emergence of US Steel, for example, the idea of sort of fostering and nurturing a local business community, it just sort of lost its sense of meaning. So that emergence of what I called collegiate capitalism, it existed in a small window, and it was sort of a really came to fore in the years immediately after the Civil War, but by 1890 it had been overtaken by the sort of broader developments with the American business community. The third thing I just wanted to sort of touch on in the presentation was what I find areas that are yearning for more research. Now, in one of my early trips to Wheeling, I heard Margaret Brennan say that the African American experience in Wheeling demands further attention, and I agree with that. I think that it underscores the fact that just because that population might have been small, it doesn't necessarily mean that there are some great stories there that will enrich our sort of overall understanding of the sense of place. But there's one other area that is perhaps not so obvious that I think really does require some more work. Now, one of my co-supervisors was her name is Frances Clark. She is an Australian, but now recognised as one of the leading historians of the US Civil War. Her recent book, which I'd recommend to anyone interested in the Civil War, is called Of Age, and it won last year's Lincoln Prize, which you may be aware is awarded to what is considered to be the most significant book on the Civil War during a year. Now, in one of her research trips to the US, she came across what I guess is best described as um, coroner's reports, which she gave me, and what they were was coroner's reports for the state of West Virginia during 1870s and 1880s, which is the period that I was particularly interested in. The reports detail the name of the deceased, the gender, the age, the occupation, and the county where they were from. Now, I approached those books with certain expectations of what I would find. And what I thought I would find was that most fatalities that were listed in the book would have been people like a buster whose notebook is included in the LaBelle records, the archives. So someone who began work at a very early age in a Wheeling nail factory, stayed there whole working life, developed either some lung or heart condition, um, and died relatively young. But that wasn't what I found. Sure, there were people like Buster, but they weren't the most conspicuous group. Does anyone want to offer any sort of suggestion as to which group would sort of dominate all others? Any suggestions? Let me tell you. They were young women, younger than the age of 30, who looked like they were Irish because of their surnames. Now, what this and when I say this group, they are highly conspicuous. Now, I became fascinated in this because, again, here's a story. It seems to me a great untold story. So I went off and was doing all this work until my supervisor said that I had actually commenced another PhD, and if I wanted to actually finish what I was doing, I should put that down and go back to the original piece, which is what I did. I always took her advice, but the work sits there and remains to be done. What I think is happening is that these were young women who were in domestic service. They were confined to the sort of like the houses in Wheeling of the great good, and they were living and working in these horrible conditions. Now, whether or not it was from the lack of ventilation, whether or not it was the fuel they were using to heat the homes, to cook, I can't sort of stress enough how conspicuous this group is. And I was thinking about it, and I couldn't help but be struck by the irony of it, because I thought to myself, you know, this is what Rebecca Harding Davis alerted everyone to all those years ago. The character in Life in the Iron Mills is the sort of person that comes across in these coronary records. And if you just think about this life that these young Irish women in domestic service must have had in those times, it was tough. But their story somehow sort of remains untold. I think Hal's work with the sort of immigrant population in South Wheeling, I think it touches a little bit on that, and it certainly sort of like highlights the fact that there are these different layers. But it just seems to me that there's a whole, bunch of stories there that that need to be told, and that perhaps put even a different dimension on the way that the wheeling community developed, how it was shaped, and it was a completely different perspective than the lives of the people that we see, you know, uh, who built monuments to themselves in Greenwood Cemetery, for example. So the great and the good. So just just to recap. So firstly, the short answer, why wheeling? It's all down to Dr. Javasak. It was reinforced by the support that I got from people like Jean with the Friends of Wheeling, the staff of the Ohio County Public Library, who I'm sort of deeply indebted to, particularly Laura Carroll, who helped me with the LaBelle archives. The second thing is, as I said, I was keen in writing a history of place that just contained great stories, and Wheeling, it seems to me, is a place that's so rich in stories that goes beyond just the local sort of history approach, but speaks to sort of a much broader concept of how American society developed, not just the form of capitalism, but relations between the labor movement, the business community. And it also shows, I think, that the development of American capitalism was not, as it's always projected, as a linear and inevitable progression, but there were different pathways. I also sort of want to just reinforce the importance of geography. Geography, it seemed to me, shaped Wheeling in all sorts of ways. I actually used as the title of my dissertation a quote from the Pittsburgh Advocate, which described Wheeling as a miserable little Virginia country town that was never going to amount to anything, but in fact became the workshop of the world. Um, uh, and and it just seemed to me that geography affected it in some ways, as Dr. Javasak has pointed out. For example, Smallback's skyscraper was built because effectively we ran out of space. So geography, the way that sort of affected the outlook of the people within the community, I think very important. And finally, just in terms of more work that needs to be done, I really think that this story that is contained in the coroner's report is one that that needs to be told. Sean, I'm conscious of the time. I'm happy to leave it there and take any questions if there are any. But again, to you, Sean, I just want to thank you for the opportunity of being able to talk to and to share my thoughts on a place which I have become very fond of.
Good morning or good afternoon, depending upon who's hearing this. I'm trying to put my thoughts together to make it as succinct as possible. One of the things you talked about is someone who we revere as being very progressive with employee relations and labor scales, and you were you attributed that somehow to, accrual accounting or having an impact on that. Just for the uninitiated, accrual accounting simply is the idea that revenue is recognized not when you receive it, but when you earn it, and expenses is not when you pay it, but when you owe it, is basically the definition of accrual accounting. And if accrual accounting emphasizes more on the cost of doing business rather than the price that you put on the goods that you're selling, a progressive wage rate would suggest that the cost of doing business would be higher because if you're paying your workers more, the cost of your product, especially in a labor-intensive company or industry, would be higher. And I was just trying to close that loop. I was a little bit lost on tying up how accrual accounting was part of that thesis of yours. Am I making myself clear?
There was a comment made, and I think it's cited in Loveday's work about the effect of the Bessemer converter on the puddlers, and the puddlers, I think, were the group that were most sort of conspicuous in terms of their costs, and they simply didn't survive. There's a quote that I think some sort of cheap remark about the introduction of the Bessemer. There goes the coffin of the puddler. But I think my point is that it wasn't just so much the cost.
Are we talking about efficiencies of mechanism, replacing labor with more efficient production methods, maybe?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. So that shone a light on where the expenses were, and I think I agree with Loveday's interpretation that this really was the driving sort of like force behind the outbreak, the nailer strike.
Hi, it's Jean. It's great to see you, and congratulations on your doctorate. I know it was a long haul.
Thank you.
With COVID in the middle and so forth. A couple things. One is you mentioned specifically the Irish immigrants, the female Irish immigrants. What kind of role, back in the day, the immigrants were flooding into Wheeling. Do you see them, I've always thought that they were what made Wheeling strong back in the day. Their entrepreneurial spirit, their willing to work, that sort of thing. Can you comment on any of that?
Can I just say before I answer that question, just in terms of getting my doctorate, my son was recently married in the Great Hall at Sydney University, which is where they have their graduation ceremonies. And there were two comments made during the wedding ceremony that still resonate with me. First of all, in my son's speech, he said that in growing up, he thought that he had the best of both worlds. In his mother, he had someone who he could turn to for advice on financial management, getting a home mortgage, and superannuation. He also had someone who he could turn to for advice on how the Civil War affected an obscure regional town in West Virginia. The MC also made an interesting point when he introduced me for my speech. He said that in a couple of weeks after the ceremony, I would be returning to the Great Hall for my graduation ceremony, which he said it seemed to be a big effort to go to just to get a 50% student discount on the venue hire. But let me just pick up Jean's point, and I need to say about something about the qualification with the records. There's an inconsistency in the description of the cause of death. Now, I think that speaks to the state of the profession. I think it also speaks to the fact that a lot of it was guesswork. And when I say Irish, I'm saying that because the surnames look to me as if they are of Irish extraction. I can't, without doing further research, I can't say for sure that they are Irish, but they just certainly, there's lots of O's in front of them, of the names. So I'm making that assumption that they are predominantly Irish. I'd be very surprised if that wasn't the case. What I was also interested in is the sort of progressive waves of immigration. I know, for example, that there was a fellow Dispar who was, assigned specifically to Europe to attract German immigrants into West Virginia specifically, but also Wheeling. And it just seems to me, and I think this is picked up in how Gorby's work, that there are waves of different immigration. Now, I thought the Irish were there very early, but the fact that their names keep on coming up in the death records of the 1870s and 1880s, and given their age, it suggests that is being sustained. Jean, I don't know whether that answers your question, but I think it was important for me to make that qualification. I can't say for sure that they're Irish, but their name suggests they are.
Brad, I have two things. Would you explain to the audience why you began your introduction, your program, with a reference to, if I do a lot of studies of Australian movies and things, and what you did today was common. So if you could explain that, and then I have one other comment after that.
Thank you for asking the question. So it's more than common. It's now, it's almost mandatory for any public address to begin with an acknowledgement of country, traditional owners. Now, I have meetings at work with staff members who will begin by making that acknowledgement of the traditional owners. In any major speech of any politician, there is, that's how we begin. At any sport fixture, whether it's an international match, whatever, we will have someone, a representative of the Aboriginal community, speak first and deliver a formal welcome to country. So this is something which, as I said, is now, it's beyond common. It's now, as I said, almost mandatory. And it is, I think, one way that that Australians have come to recognise the traditional owners of the land. It's ironic that we recently had a referendum that would have, if approved, granted special status of Aboriginal communities in the Parliament, but it didn't succeed. But we do have this now sort of mandatory approach where we recognise the traditional owners of the land in which we speak. I'm actually speaking to you today from the Central Coast, and the particular Aboriginal community is the Darjinkum people. If I was speaking to you from Sydney, I would have acknowledged the Gadigal people, who were the local community in Sydney at that time.
And finally, for recognition, I have had the opportunity to read a couple of your chapters, and I will tell the people who are assembled here today that you have produced the most scholarly work on whaling history in a very long time. And I think it's interesting that whaling now has this wonderful connection with a wonderful person from Sydney, Australia. And I have enjoyed our relationship as a result of that. So I thank you for that.
That's very kind of you, David. Thank you.
Two more. It's Jean again. I would just like to say that I would love to have you come back to Wheeling and sit in a room with you, David Javersack, Hal Gorby, Margaret Brennan, and just have a conversation. And so please, please try to come back at some point.
Well, as I sort of said at the start, I'm hoping to return to sort of to find a publisher for my dissertation. As David said, there's probably more interest in my work in West Virginia than there is in the land of the Gadigal people. I must also say, when my supervisors said that they needed to find some examiners, external examiners, they had to look to the States because there was no one in Australia that was in a position to do it. I was hoping that they would find some people, perhaps from Alaska or Wyoming, as far away from Wheeling as possible to give me some leverage. Much to my surprise, they found someone at the University of West Virginia who was surprisingly quite complimentary of the work. So I'd be sort of keen to explore publishing possibilities through the University of West Virginia Press, and that would be the attraction for me to come back.
One more question.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm so thankful that you mentioned the African community. So hopefully, when you complete everything and you come back, I would love to have the opportunity to hear you elaborate the contributions from the African community in Wheeling. Thank you so much for briefly mentioning that.
I know that this program has had representations from some leading scholars. In fact, I remember particularly sitting in, I think, the room that you're in, listening to Ken Phones-Wolf when he said that Wheeling is a place that demands further research and has been overlooked. I think that's true, but I also think that that whole African American experience just cries out. And I know Sean is alert to that. I've seen some stuff that he's been posting, but I'm also just forever mindful of what those words from Margaret Brennan, who I think was one of the sort of early identifiers. But there's a, again, there's so many stories to be told, but that does loom large.
Another hand for Brad, and thank you for getting up. But before you go, we have a gift for you. We're going to show you, and then I'll have to mail it to you. But stand by.
Thank you, everyone.
I heard you mention Dr. Javersek's famous Aloha shirts. So I had one made for you, if you can see that, with Dr. Javersek on it. Yeah? It's very nice. So we'll mail that to you, and just so he wouldn't be left out, we made one for Dr. J with your picture on it. You can see here, Brad, on this shirt. We have to open the packet, but there you are. There you go.
That's very nice.
You two can be heroes from halfway around the world. All right. Thanks again, Brad.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.